Oh, hello there. We are, if I can get this thing going, there we go. We are looking at Chapter 10, Key Issue 4 today. We're going to be talking about mostly the third agricultural revolution. So you should have a notepad ready to add things to your notes. Remember, you did a chart for Chapter 10, Key Issue 3. We're going back to just normal notes, Chapter 10, Key Issue 4, so that's what you should be doing. And I'll get started so we can get this done. Okay, so as I said, we're talking about the third agricultural revolution. Remember, the first agricultural revolution was when we switched from hunters and gatherers to the domestication of animals and permanent settlements. The second agricultural revolution was the switch to mechanization of farming, so machines doing most of the work instead of people doing most of the work, although as we've talked about, there's lots of forms of agriculture that still use lots of labor, right? Intensive agricultural practices. And then the third agricultural revolution is when we really started to emphasize commercial farming, and we started using things like fertilizers and pesticides and started creating high yield seeds, okay, which are basically GMOs, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, okay? So the Green Revolution took place during the Third Agricultural Revolution. So when you think Green Revolution, it's just part of the Third Agricultural Revolution. Now here's what's confusing. In modern day society, we tend to use that word green like going green in a positive light, right? It means eating organic and recycling and taking better care of the environment. When we say green revolution, that isn't really what we're talking about, okay? We're actually talking about using pesticides and chemicals, which I think a lot of us today would say is not very green practice, okay? So try not to confuse those two. We really mean two different things. A lot of times students think green revolution is that, oh, it's the push to start eating organic foods, and that's not it. If anything, eating organic foods is kind of a reaction to the green revolution. Okay, so this movement has lots of positive effects, but it also had a lot of negative effects, so we're going to go over both of those. And I picked this chart for you to kind of start to introduce what the positive effect was. This is India. This right here, this first measurement is right when the Green Revolution was beginning. And as you can see, over time, huge increase in crop yield, which is really important for places like India because we know that India is going to be the most populated country in the world here in the next few years. Their population puts a huge strain on the resources, one of which is food. So the more food they're producing, the better it is for India. And then this is on a global scale. It shows you that there has been a huge increase in cereal production. And just a reminder, when we say cereal, we're talking about cereal grain, right? We're talking about grain production. It's not like all of a sudden people started eating a lot more Fruit Loops, okay? Obviously. That would be a silly thing to measure. Okay, but the negative impacts of the Green Revolution is that with chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides, those things are not great for the environment, okay? Also irrigation. Irrigation causes digging and the need to alter the environment, and whenever man alters the environment, there are negative consequences, right? It's done for a reason, and it usually does the job that we intend it to do, but there's like these unintended negative consequences a lot of the time. Also, the chemicals that we use to do these things and these high yield seeds that we started developing are very expensive. So although it's good for India because they are creating a lot more food, it's also negative because it's not a huge economy, right? The Indian economy, for the population it has, their economy is not that great. So it puts a huge strain on their economy. Okay, the other thing we're going to talk about is agribusiness, which is basically the business of agriculture. So we're talking about commercial farming when we're talking about agribusiness. We're not talking about subsistence agriculture, because obviously subsistence agriculture is just people growing food for their own survival, right? Agribusiness is you are growing food to make a buck, okay? So what is happening, especially during the third agricultural revolution, is these big commercial farms are starting to push out these smaller farms, okay? So especially in the United States, there are a lot more of these gigantic commercial farming industries like Foster Farms, Monsanto, right? You guys have probably heard very nasty things about Monsanto, and most of them are true. So, and kind of pushing out like those small, like kind of mom and pop farms, okay? I know there are a few in Reno who are kind of making a comeback, but for the most part, most of our food that we eat comes from a big commercial farm, okay? So that's something that has happened during the third agricultural revolution. We've also developed these complex commodity chains, right? And commodity, I know that's been a vocab word for you guys before, so you know what that means. If you don't, refresh yourself. But basically it means that most of these farmers who are in the commercial agriculture business are not just growing crops anymore, right? They're also creating relationships with different markets. They are, if you are a livestock rancher, it's quite likely that you might be doing the slaughtering yourself, so you might also own a slaughterhouse. And then you probably have a relationship with Raley's, let's say, or Save Mart, let's say. So what I'm trying to show you is that we've always kind of considered agriculture a primary economic activity, right? You are getting a resource, okay? But now in agribusiness, a lot of these farmers are actually participating in each sector of the economy. So they're doing primary economic activities, which is the farming. They're doing secondary economic activities, which would be churning the livestock into meat, right? And they're doing tertiary economic activities by having that relationship with the market and selling that meat. Okay, so agribusiness is really the combination of all three economic activities. And lots of commercial farmers, because if they control all aspects, that's less that they're having to pay for and more that they're profiting from, right? We call that horizontal integration as well. That makes it a lot easier, right, to make a profit. Okay, so this is related to what I was just talking about, agribusiness. I would say, so just a warning, there are a lot of models you have to memorize this semester. It's the second semester is the model semester. So this is the first one we're going to look at. An important thing to remember when you're talking about models is you have to remember what they're in relation to, okay? Von Thunen is an agricultural model that looks at transportation costs, okay? I would write down that very sentence. Von Thunen is an agricultural land use model that looks at transportation costs, okay? And we're gonna go over this in class too. We're gonna do an activity with it. I'm just gonna explain it really quickly for you here. So we have the urban center, okay? So where lots of the markets are going to be, the stores that sell the produce and the meat and all of the foodstuffs go in the center, okay? Then on the outside is where you would find dairy farming, okay? So we need to think about, in regards to transportation costs, that means getting the product from where it came from to the store. Why would you want dairy farming right next to market gardening or to the market? It's because dairy spoils, right? So it costs a lot to ship dairy because you're going to need to do it really quickly, and otherwise it's going to spoil. So you want dairy farming really, really close. Forests, so wood. Wood doesn't spoil. So why would you need wood to be so close to the market? Well, it's because wood is really, really heavy. And the heavier something is, the more it's going to cost to transport it. So that's why you want that relatively close to the urban center here. Okay, grains and field crops, ranching and livestock. Grains and field crops, not super heavy, pretty easy to transport, so you can have them further out here. Ranching and livestock, you're typically not transporting the livestock itself. What are you usually transporting? The meat, right? So that isn't super heavy. And what both of these have in common is you need a lot of space, right? So you couldn't have a livestock ranch in downtown Sparks because there's no room for that, right? So it's got to be further away from the market in order to have the space to do so. In addition, people don't like to live right next to a ranch for the most part because it doesn't smell very good. So most people are going to live in the urban center, and further out, you're going to have those things that people don't want to live next to. Okay, so here's something else to remember about Von Thunen. This is an older model. I would say kind of second agricultural revolution. This was a pretty true model. Nowadays, this doesn't exist as much. I think we would still say that most of ranching and livestock does happen in rural areas, but there's lots of reasons why this isn't as accurate as it is today, and I'm going to go over some of those reasons. Okay. So again, the importance of transportation cost is what Von Thunen is based off of. Sometimes I say Von Thunen, but I think it's supposed to be Von Thunen. The H is silent like Neanderthal or apartheid. Okay, so I gave you this example of Florida and their citrus production, and you will notice that there's really no rhyme or reason to where a lot of these farms are. Okay, so a lot of times, lots of California agriculture also doesn't follow the Von Thunen model. And a lot of this is because we just have better technology today that doesn't affect transportation costs as much. So we have things like refrigerated trucks. So because we have refrigeration, it's not super necessary for dairy farming to be so close to the urban center. And in fact, dairy farming has moved sort of to the outskirts because dairy comes from cows, and cows also smell, right? Whether they're being raised for meat or raised for dairy, they kind of smell the same. So they've kind of been pushed to the outside, and it also takes, especially with these huge commercial dairy farms, they take up a lot of space. So they need the space, and now that they have refrigeration of trucks, it's okay for it to be further out. Okay, so there's lots of technological advancements that have made Von Thunen not as true as it used to be. Okay, all right, so moving on to sustainable agriculture. So the word sustainable, we've used that a lot. It means we're looking at our current practices and we're measuring whether or not they can continue and continue to feed the world, right? So is this something that we can keep up? If it is, we would say it's sustainable, right? If it's not, then we would say it's not sustainable, okay? Oftentimes people talk about oil as being a non-sustainable resource. It's because it's getting harder and harder to collect, and our reserves are depleting, so that would be a not sustainable resource. Whereas if there was an abundance of oil, we would say that's probably sustainable. Okay, so introduction of biotechnology and GMOs that have kind of characterized the third agricultural revolution. Although we're making all of this food, it's actually not a sustainable practice, okay? So this has led to an ongoing debate as to, like, so we have this huge crop yield, but we're also eroding soil at a faster rate than we ever have before. And so most people would say that that's not a sustainable practice. But we're still creating all of this food. So there's this debate going on, especially when it comes to GMOs, which are genetically modified organisms. When it comes to food, it just means that the food has been altered, right? Or the seeds to make the food have been altered, those high yield seeds, okay? And there's a lot more food available because of GMOs, but as you guys have seen, even while working on your scavenger hunt projects, there's this pride in saying that something doesn't contain GMOs, right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in class. So if that's not totally clear, don't worry. We're going to have a debate about GMOs in class, okay? So another example a problem challenging sustainable agriculture would be overfishing. So this is the image that I've provided for you here. Basically, overfishing is when you're catching so much fish that the fish that are left behind can't reproduce enough in order to replace what you have taken out of the ocean, okay? And that's a big problem. We don't hear a lot about it in the US, but it's especially a problem in a lot of Asian countries. Japan has a huge overfishing problem. Fish doesn't have the same place in our diets that it does in a lot of other countries. Americans don't eat as much fish as Japan or China or a lot of those other countries. So, but anyways, so we are also dealing with a reduction in biodiversity. So the extinction of fish types and plant life over time. Lots of overgrazing is happening. Livestock is great for meat, but you have to feed that livestock, and lots of cows on a piece of land is not good for that piece of land, basically. Depletion of water in river and aquifers. We're using so much water to water all of these surplus of crops that we have, but we're running out of water resources. Methane gas from animal waste. This is something people don't think about very often, but just like human beings, cows produce gas, right? And that gas is especially bad for the environment. It's methane gas. It's not a good thing. And we've talked about before the extensive fertilizer and pesticide use. These are all things that are challenging the future of agriculture. If we keep using all of these things, if we keep producing these results, then we're going to have problems. We're already starting to see problems, but they're only going to worsen over time. So we have to do a lot of reflecting about how we create food. This is why there's this huge movement in the US to really start thinking about where your food comes from. And maybe you've even heard something simple like Meatless Mondays. It's probably better if we ate less meat. But as you saw on that map from, I think, Key Issue 3, we eat more meat than any other country besides Australia. So, yeah, that's kind of where the current state of agriculture is at. We are making more food than ever before. There are still people that are starving, however, and if we keep going the way that we're going, then we're going to run into some really big problems. So maybe you guys can come up with some solutions and save the world. That would be awesome. All right, so this was your last video for Chapter 10, which is also Unit 5. So if you are done with all your key issues, it's time to start studying. Get that cram sheet put together. Make sure your key term flashcards are done. And get ready for the test. And have a good day.